really excited to be here today to join you with Dan and Karl, and really excited to have a chat about life skills and youth sport. So we're just going to go through a few of our ideas, share some research, and we're going to go back and forth between the three of us to kind of share what we're thinking about life skills and sport, but really open it up to questions and discussion. So to get us started, we really want to introduce to you to some general conceptions and definitions of life skills and our focus on life skills within a positive youth development or PYD framework. Now, positive youth development is a strengths-based conception of development in which children and adolescents are viewed as having resources to be developed rather than kind of thinking about it as being problems to be solved. So within the focus of PYD, we often operationalize life skills as those resources that can be developed. And here we're thinking about life skills as the interpersonal assets, characteristics, and skills, such as goal setting, emotional control, self-esteem, hard work, that can be facilitated and developed in sport and then transferred to non-sport settings. So within that definition, again, we're really thinking about both the process of developing and learning life skills through sport, through the sport context, but also how they're used, transferred, and applied to contexts and domains outside of sport. And when we think about life skills, it's easy to limit ourselves to not only to view life skills as just kind of those discrete cognitive or behavioral skills that an athlete takes from sport and then applies to other domains. I think we can also think about them in relation to some maybe greater developmental changes that youth experience. So for the sake of our conversation today, we're really going to broaden our definition of life skills a little and think about the development of knowledge, conceptual, procedural, tacit knowledge that can be developed through sport, as well as shifts in dispositions, mindsets, things like changes in behavioral or motivational orientations or changes in development, such as the challenge mindset related to resilience, and even more of a holistic identity construction or transformation. So we're going to take a bit more of a broad approach to defining life skills as a PYD outcome. So to help us fully understand the process of PYD and life skill development and transfer, Karl's going to share some general guiding frameworks to help us understand how we can use and promote life skills and transfer through sport.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. And thanks to everyone, excuse me, to echo Scott, thanks for having us here and for joining us today. Really looking forward to the discussion as we get going. We've thrown up this crazy complicated diagram here. It's actually recently put together by Dr. Travis Dorsch and a number of other colleagues who work in this field. And we bring it up not that you have to memorize or that we're going to go through all parts of this, but just to highlight that while today we're mostly talking about sort of the coach's role in working with athletes to facilitate life skills development, neither the coach nor the athlete, when we do our work in these contexts, is in a bubble. We are all embedded within sort of these larger systems of influence, other people around that influence what we do and how kids respond to what we do. So one of the things we kind of wanted to keep in mind as we go through and as we get into more of our sort of more coach and kid focused work is that as coaches, we're never alone, right? So we need to sort of at least be aware of and at best work together with the other people, the other contexts, the other settings, organizations, et cetera, that are going to have an influence on the lives of the kids and the lessons that they learn through all the various experiences, which include but are not limited to the maybe hour or 2 hours that they're with us as coaches. We want to sort of keep in mind that we're embedded within a larger system as well, and that's also going to influence what kids get and the effectiveness of what we do in trying to facilitate life skills development. The only other thing I wanted to draw your attention to here is sort of, I don't know if you can see it, but at the bottom there's sort of a time arrow going across, and it has sort of like different stages of child development listed there. And I just wanted to sort of keep that in the back of our minds as we're going through what you might call thinking developmentally, right? Where a lot of the stuff we're going to talk through today, again, sort of very coach-centric, what coaches can actually do or think about to develop life skills in their young athletes. The principles are going to hold up when we're working with young people across different age groups, across different sort of stages of development. It just might look a little different. For example, a 5-year-old is not the same as a 9-year-old, is not the same as a 15-year-old, right? So the specific manifestations, the specific ways that we actually do the things that we're going to be talking about a little bit later might look a little bit different in practice. The sort of the nitty-gritty details might have to be adapted to the specific level of the kids that we're working with. One last sort of point in terms of this sort of thinking developmentally is not just adapting to the kid, but recognizing that whatever we do as coaches and working with young athletes, we're one point along their path towards hopefully happy and healthy lives. right? So we may not have to sort of fix everything, do all the stuff, teach all the lessons right now. Our job is to sort of just help them continue down along the path, set them up so that hopefully other people, other experiences can help contribute to that happy, healthy life. So again, I just wanted to sort of layer those in there. Again, as we talk more sort of coach-centric and kid-centric now, that this is embedded within the sort of that larger system and through time. All right, the next one.
Thanks, Karl. Yeah, so today we're going to really focus on 4 important considerations for coaching life skills. And as Karl pointed out, there's no perfect recipe for coaching life skills. There's obviously a lot of complex systems, but we're going to hopefully provide you with some kind of in-depth recommendations and ideas to help position you to best facilitate life skill development transfer. First, we're going to talk about how life skills are brought. So we'll talk about the need to recognize that youth bring a lot to the table to sport, and we need to individualize our coaching to them. Second, we're going to think about life skills being caught. We'll explore ways to structure the environment to support implicit life skill learning and transfer. Then we're going to think about life skills being taught. We'll discuss ways to explicitly coach and teach life skills. And then finally, life skills being bought will highlight the goal of having youth and kids buy into life skills learning and transfer.
In terms of life skills are brought, one of the things that we're finding in our research here at the Institute for the Study of Youth Sports is sometimes there's almost like an assumption when we're coaching that the kids come in as blank slates. Well, they don't. They come in with certain life skills already. So they don't enter youth sports as a blank slate. So that means it's very important for us to get to know our players and probably their parents. One study we just did shows that a lot of times in sport, we're reinforcing values that parents have emphasized to the kids at home, whether it's hard work or whether it's showing empathy to other kids, etc. Now, obviously, not all kids necessarily come from backgrounds where maybe the best skills or dispositions are emphasized. So we kind of want to get an assessment of that. So you might be thinking, what are my players' life skill strengths? What are their needs? And you may get this from thinking a little bit about the community. If I'm working in a real underserved area with a lot of kids coming from single family homes where the parent is just getting by and probably doesn't have the time to spend with that child, some of our research shows those kids will come in with more needs, maybe some more attentional difficulties. It'll be a little maybe harder to coach at first until you establish some routines. Versus I'm sort of reinforcing a lot of good patterns parents have always set up. Now, one way you might look at this to do is, just to do a quick assessment is ask your kids, what does it take to be a great athlete in this sport? What kind of things would they say? Would they talk about hard work? Would they talk about discipline? Would they talk about communication? You might add a few things for them, but that might give you an assessment of like where they're at. So let's go on to caught.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so we wanted to sort of take a moment here before we get into sort of the more direct and intentional teaching strategies that Dan's going to talk about in a few minutes here. We wanted to think about the idea that life skills learning for kids doesn't start and stop just with our direct teaching. That may be sort of some of the most intensive and sort of emphatic ways of getting those messages through, but kids are always learning. There's sort of an old school saying in child development, kids are scientists, right? That's essentially the job of kids. They're continuously and constantly trying to figure out how the world works and what's their place in it, right? So they're paying attention to all sorts of stuff that's going on in every experience they have. So in those moments when we're, in between the times when we're maybe like directly teaching sort of very targeted or explicit life skills lessons, we can maybe think of what are the messages that the environments we're setting up around our athletes, in our teams, in our programs, in our organizations. What are the messages that are being sent there? And can we set up those environments so that even when we're not doing the explicit teaching, young athletes or young kids are having experiences, being put in situations, being rewarded for the development of life skills or attempts to work on their life skills. So you might think of sort of just going through, I think maybe even auditing, kind of, informally mentally auditing our own programs, teams, environments, et cetera, to say what's being rewarded here, right? What opportunities are being provided? What messages are being sent about what's valued? You know, do we encourage creativity and risk taking? Are there opportunities for athletes to have some ownership and leadership in these environments? What are the peer dynamics like? Because a lot of the research shows that those little things can add up to sort of the messages that athletes take, right? And it's going to happen anyway, right? And if we're not intentional, it can potentially go the other way, right? So what we're saying here with life skills being caught is we're not getting into sort of the old trope of, you know, sports are magic, and just the fact that there's a basketball or whatever here automatically leads to life skill development, but just that we can engineer the entire environment so that things are happening sort of even outside of our direct attention, and trying to figure out, well, if the stuff that we're going to do anyway, right? Like we're going to set up drills and activities, we're going to offer some instruction and feedback, right? We're going to, you know, try and create a particular culture here. We're going to offer praise for certain things, right? Can we just say, well, if we're going to do it anyway, is there a way to just tweak it slightly, right? So that some opportunities for life skill development, so that life skill progress and learning is rewarded. So there are chances for athletes to, you know, work with their teammates to solve some problems by themselves without the coach stepping in and just spoon feeding everything to them, right? So it which sort of leads to the second point, the idea of, especially in these sort of more implicit environmental ways, a little actions can go a long way, right? It's not necessarily like ripping down all your coaching stuff, right? And totally reinventing it in new ways, or, you know, adding hours of extra stuff that you're trying to figure out how to get in, right? It can be like tweaking, are there opportunities to tweak the things that we're already going to do anyway in ways that might just slightly more strongly prioritize and emphasize life skill development. For example, Scott and I recently conducted a study on leadership development in high school sports here in the US, right? And what we found as well, yes, some direct teaching from the coach helped and worked and really supported leadership development, even just opportunities to be in leadership roles, to try things and have them not work sometimes and be supported in working through that, right? Sort of in a natural progression from in the 4 years of high school here in the US, freshman, sophomore, junior to senior, that the sort of natural progression allowed athletes to take on gradually more and more responsibility and really work their own way through, with coaches just sort of allowing it or encouraging it, right? So there are things that we can do. And part of that goes with the notion of how we talk matters, right? So the way that we interact with our athletes. Again, if we are at some point going to interact with our athletes, right, it's impossible to avoid. So can we make sure that the ways that we interact either sort of, again, directly support life skills development, or at least don't go in the other direction? A recent study we conducted a few years ago now tracked sort of some young athletes over the course of the season, a bunch of developmental outcomes. We were looking at sort of their change over the season in relation to the way that coaches interact with them. We tracked a whole bunch of crazy stuff, looking at instruction and feedback styles, all sorts of stuff. And the single biggest predictor of positive development of life skills learning over the course of the season for these athletes was the degree to which coaches talked to them about non-sport stuff. So asking them about life stuff, school, family, homework, etc. Athletes who got more of that experienced more positive development, right? So those little things matter, and often it's the way that we interact with our athletes, the way we develop real relationships and set up environments for those relationships that reward life skills learning, that provide opportunities for athletes to experiment and try life skills, and I can sort of nudge them in a direction as a complement to perhaps the more direct teaching of life skills that Dan is going to talk about now.
So as you see here, I have this quote: life skills are best taught versus caught. This doesn't go against what Karl just said. If we look at, we did a large review of all the studies here in the US, and there's been one I know of in the UK. And when they look at kids and sport in general, kids learn more positive things from sport than they do negative. There's times they learn negative, but in general, sport's a pretty good thing for kids. But we know we load the dice in our favor or amplify the positive effects if we're very intentional. And that's where, you know, we're going to get more bang for our buck, more values, more good dispositions coming from the kid if we're intentional in terms of teaching those. So if we look on the next slide, let's talk about some specific things that you can do as a coach. First is ties to your coaching philosophy. prioritize and define the life skills you want to teach or coach. I mean, there's a ton of life skills: teamwork, leadership, discipline, being on time, communication. Which of those do you think are most important for kids to learn? We know from studying coaches that are very good at teaching life skills or coaching life skills that they don't always prioritize the same life skills to the same degree. So, like, what are you going to feature? What are you going to emphasize with your team? That may come from your own coaching philosophy. And as I said earlier in the presentation, it may come from sort of a needs assessment of what you think your kids need. So pick 2 or 3 things to focus on during the year, talk about with the kids, etc. This brings me to the second point. Talk to your athletes about the skill. Tell them why it's important to communicate well. Or if you talk about concentration or attention. First, most of these skills, if we say something like discipline, that's going to mean all sorts of things to different kids. So you might say a disciplined athlete is one that shows up for training on time. A disciplined athlete is one that doesn't lose emotional control when the other kid is playing a little dirty or when they get a bad call. So it's really important that you define the skill, but then talk to the kids about why it's important or ask them why. As Karl said, getting kids to discuss these things. Too often as coaches, we give lectures. Getting kids to talk about why communication is important on the pitch in football. And then later you might drop in, well, how is communication important with your family or in school? Third point I have on the slide is model the skill. If I'm a coach that emphasizes emotional control and I lose it on the sidelines on a regular basis, the kids are not going to learn that lesson very well. What they'll learn is when you're a kid, you have to be quiet. And when you're an adult, you can go crazy. That's not the lesson you're probably intending. So we have to be good models ourselves. In one recent study we did, if we can go back that slide, one recent study we did, we found, an athlete learned a lot about emotional control from observing her basketball coach. She knew he was upset, but then he didn't yell at the team. We also know peers, the peers, like if somebody bullies on the team, that's going to lead to problems. So we want good peers. And we want to point out like high status models, pro athletes that exhibit the kind of traits we want. Okay, if we go to the next slide. If possible, this isn't always easy, but if you can construct some practice situations to use the skill. A good example, we did a study of a wrestling coach, and he'd put the kids at an appropriate age, in hard physical training. These were high school age boys, 15, 16, real high physical training where fatigue came in. And then he'd talk about like the importance of concentration and effort and how they can't give up just because it's hard. So he put them in a situation where, that kind of focus and adherence was maximized and then reinforced and talked about it. As Karl mentioned earlier, look for a teachable moment. If 2 kids get into a little altercation on the field and push or something, if you have a whistle, blow the whistle, bring the team in, talk about why it might have happened, how they might have handled it differently. And sometimes this isn't rocket science. I used to work with pair skaters. And if a lot of times they're there 8 hours a day working in close proximity, they might have different personalities and they start arguing. So if you felt frustrated, we just turn them to turn away from the other person and take a deep breath before they said something. Third point on this slide, we want to reinforce the skills. So if I see the kids doing, like if I see signs of good teamwork, I want to yell out what it was. I want to maybe in a post practice huddle say, hey, Jonathan did a great job distributing the ball today and being unselfish. And as Scott's going to talk about next, or in a few minutes, we'll talk about coaching for transfer. A lot of these life skills are really things that will help your team perform better and help the kid perform better in sport, but we're hoping they carry on to other venues. So Life skills are best taught as well as caught.
Thanks, Dan. So finally, we just want to bring it back to kind of our youth-centered focus and really the emphasis that life skills are bought by the athletes, and the young athlete really is the driver of life skills development and transfer. As we think about our long-term potential impact as coaches, I really like a quote from a famous football coach here, Amos Alonso Stair. He once said, "I won't know how good a job I did for 20 years. That's when I'll really see how my boys turned out." So that coach to us really indicates that as coaches, we can't really always control if the life skills lessons and skills are going to stick. However, with that, we can kind of put ourselves and put our kids in the best position to learn and transfer these life skills. First, we really want to facilitate buy-in by empowering youth. So ways we can do that, and kind of it's reflected in some of the examples that Dan and Karl brought up, is to promote reflection and awareness, conscious awareness of the life skills that are being learned and that can be transferred. So we can have debriefing sessions to explicitly discuss what life skills are learned, how they were learned, and then how they can be used and applied in other areas of life. We also really want to promote agency and autonomy, and really having the youth feel like they're in control and in charge of the skills that they're learning. So if you're coaching leadership, for example, as Karl talked about, we recently did a study on that. We found that those youth that felt empowered to make real decisions in their sport, so designing practices, planning team events, and then they were encouraged by the coaches, encouraged by others to take on leadership roles outside of sports, such as in school committees and in the community. They really felt like they were in charge and they had their own agency and autonomy over their leadership, and they were more likely to use it across different domains. And then finally, we want to instill confidence in learning and transfer. So really, to have youth buy into their life skills, coaches need to take interest beyond sport. So really have an understanding of what's going on in their lives in school and work and other areas. So then they can encourage, support, and really stay in contact to really drive home and help those life skills stick in other areas of life. And then with that, we know that life skill development and transfer doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's not devoid of context and culture. So our point that we really want to think about is congruence. So congruence with messages can really help to seal the deal. By congruence, we're talking about the degree of similarity in philosophies, messages, and behaviors between youth athletes, parents, coaches, teachers, and also the degree of similarity between developmental contexts, so between home life, sport life, the classroom, and other activities. And as Dan mentioned, we recently did a study on a wrestling camp, intensive wrestling camp here in the US. Their mission was to teach a set of life skills, 7 life skills, such as hard work, discipline, responsibility, and accountability. And they were deliberately designed through the sport of wrestling. So aligned really nicely with the sport and the objectives and the goals of the sport. And what we found with that is that the messages really resonated with some of the athletes, some of the young athletes in the camp. Young male athletes, a lot of them white in the rural Midwest of the United States, they found that these life skills really transferred to a lot of their work. So a lot of their physically demanding tasks, such as laboring jobs, farm work, any kind of physically demanding task. And it was interesting as we thought about it, not only were those life skills aligned with wrestling, aligned with their physically demanding tasks, but also kind of drove home those ideologies of the American dream, where opportunities are possible for everyone, and meritocracy, where if you work hard, success goes to those who earn it. So for these young athletes, congruence was kind of seen throughout their sport, throughout the messages they were getting at home from the coaches at the wrestling camp, and from the culture and the ideologies that they were kind of living with. So congruence is really important, but if you're thinking, okay, that all sounds great, it's not that easy, then you're right. Obviously, congruence, we can't always achieve that. So we can't always control the life skills messaging and priorities outside of sport. And we found that in the wrestling camp study. Some of the former athletes who went to the wrestling camp said, okay, these life skills were all great, they were good, but they didn't gel, or they didn't kind of mesh with the experiences I had outside of life, where maybe there were social barriers and things like wealth and social capital and opportunity that limited kind of this idea that that hard work always brings success. So for those examples, kind of a lack of congruence made it harder for the athletes to buy into the life skills and really transfer them. So just again, a highlight of some of the challenges we have in coaching life skills and some of the realities. And Dan's going to expand on that a little bit just to wrap us up with this discussion.
Yeah, so sort of a reality check. Obviously, the three of us are devoting a significant part of our lives to helping coaches to, helping you do your job of helping kids develop as people as well as good little athletes. But I think it's the reality check is why coaching life skills sometimes falls short. And the first thing I put down here is a lack of a coach buy-in. Studying coaches from all different sports, one of the things we found over the years is the coaches who prioritize 2 or 3 life skills and sort of emphasize those get better results than coaches who kind of do lip service to it or say the right thing, but then after a couple of losses, there's no emphasis on life skills. So my advice to you as a coach would be pick a few things you want to feature and then kind of focus on that and be consistent over time. And what I have in the brackets there, belief in the sport evangelist myth. One sociologist of sport talked about what gets in the way of teaching life skills is, and I've worked with coaches in all different sports, and they all say their sport is the best. And somehow if you play that sport, and I love all the sports, you're going to be a better person because you played it. And I think our research shows, yeah, you might get some caught effect, but you're going to get the big effects when it's taught. So don't go in thinking that somehow sport is magical and it makes better people. The environment, as Karl said, the coaches, the peers are what make better people through sport. And as was mentioned earlier, inconsistent messaging, you maximize your effects. If we go back to that diagram Karl covered with all the different parts of the systems, the peers, the coaches, the school, the community, the more congruence, the more consistency you get between coaches and parents, parents and peers, the more likely you're going to get effects. So if the coach talked about the importance of concentration, and he or she talks to the parents about that, and the parents kind of emphasize that, and the parents and peers start doing it, you're kind of amplifying the effects, loading the dice in your favor. And finally, as a coach, say one thing, but sometimes we do others. And there's, all of us, we're far from perfect, and we all have bad days where we're frustrated. Things don't go well, and we might say something to a kid we didn't mean. So on those one-off days, we probably should come back and apologize and say we shouldn't have done it, if that was the case. And in general, try to catch ourselves. Like, I'm frustrated. I had a bad day. I'm going to take 2 or 3 minutes before practice, even if we start a couple minutes late, to reboot, to kind of clear my head. So, I don't kind of give it to the kids. Scott and I are working on a study with another colleague right now where we've interviewed people who played sport 50 years ago. And one thing that's amazed me is, this is 50 some years since they played their sports as a 16, 15, 17-year-old. And yet they remember specific things coaches said. They remember specific lessons. And they also talked about one person who actually didn't play very much in basketball, but sat the bench, but felt he learned a lot about teamwork. He learned a lot about roles on a team. And when he went into the insurance industry across his career, he felt what he learned, even when he didn't play, from his coach about teamwork, about roles, helped him have more empathy for people on his teams and industry, and helped him move up the managerial ranks because he learned these teamwork skills. So 2 points there. One, what kids learn can transfer. And 2, little things we say that we may never remember. Actually, when we interviewed coaches, they never remembered saying certain things to athletes, but the athletes remembered them 50 years later.